I have a few messages that I'll be presenting, and I think that the broad title of them is As We Approach Midnight. As we approach midnight, we're going to be focusing a lot on the subject of methodology, parable teaching, and we're going to look at some applications of this methodology. But as we approach midnight, I'd like to take this first hour that we have together to lay down some lines of thought that relate to developments in recent times within the movement. All right, so of course, for a bit of background, we know that the subject of time setting was opened up by Parminder, initially in 2012, and of course it was brought into focus at last year's International Camp meeting. If you're looking for notes, I don't have notes. I don't have any notes, unfortunately. So you won't find any in your booklets. Right. The subject of time setting was brought into focus at last year's International Camp. And of course, that was just in time. As we saw in the fall of last year, Sister Tess brought the message of what we understand to be the Midnight Cry, which is a body of messages that is bringing into focus what fact? The fact that November 9, 2019, the 9th of November of this year marks the close of probation for this group of people, the priests. Now, having said that, we have the message that has been brought into focus, but there's also a methodology that is also come into focus in connection with that message. And that methodology has been referred to as parable teaching. Now, what I want to do is to lay out the development of methodology within the movement, and then make a point. Right? I'm going to lay it out briefly in summary fashion, and then make a point, speaking to, again, developments that are current within our movement. So when we look at our line, we mark its commencement at the time of the end, of course, which is 1989. Okay, but we know that this is typified by 1798, is it not? By 1798. And we know that both these times of the end are brought to view in the same verse, of course, which is Daniel 11, verse 40. 1798 parallels 1989. And what do we see being put in place in 1989? We have the message, the first angel's message, being unsealed, yes? But we have not only the first angel's message being unsealed, we see a symbolic identification of the methodology that the message is based on, also in 1798. We see that this was the year that Miller received his Cruden's Concordance. This was the year Miller received his Cruden's Concordance, and the Cruden's Concordance is a symbol of his methodology, the proof text methodology, because in order to proof text in accordance with his 14 rules, the rules upon which the messages that he preached were based, in order to proof text, you needed a concordance. You need a concordance, right? To trace words through the Bible and then bring them together and allow each word to have its influence in order to form your theory. So we see at the time of the end, both the message and the methodology are brought into view. So we lay this out simply to say that at the time of the end here, we should and we do see the same thing, right? 1989, we have the message being unsealed. This is the first angel's message in our history. We have not only the message, but we also have the methodology being put in place at the time of the end. And the methodology put in place here, of course, is prophetic line upon prophetic line, the prophetic line methodology. 1989, you have both the reform lines and Daniel 11, 40 to 45, beginning to be understood and put on the, and beginning to be understood, right? So 1989 is the beginning of a progressive development of the message. I think, yes, the message, to be sure, we can trace that, we can see it more readily, but it's also the beginning of a progressive development of the methodology. Because when we come to the next waymark, or rather the next waymark I want us to take note of, this was 9/11. What do we see happening at 9/11? At 9/11, we have a confirmation of the methodology. We have a confirmation of the methodology. Why? Because what is if you boil down the prophetic line methodology into a single sentence, right? A sentence that encapsulates the broad idea behind the methodology. It's the idea that sacred histories repeat in both the sequence and the nature of the events portrayed. That's what is brought to you by the prophetic line methodology. So we take sacred histories and we see that they repeat in the sequence of events, the order of the events, and in the nature of the events, the characteristics of those events. What that allows us to do, it allows us to detect patterns which then give us templates for the sequence and order of events in our line at the end of the world. Yes? That's the basic idea, is it not? Right. So what we saw at 9/11 was a confirmation of the methodology. How? Because we saw that Millerite history was repeating. That was a key belief, a key understanding that Millerite history is repeating to the very letter. And between 1989 and 9/11, well, actually we detect a time of darkness preceding 1989 as we see prior to the time of the end in Millerite history. We see an unsealing of a message. We see the same thing at 1798. We see an increase of knowledge and formalization, just as we see in Millerite history also. And in Millerite history, we have Miller's rules being confirmed by the fulfillment of a prophecy in relation to the second woe, radical Islam. And of course, we're in great controversy that the event confirmed the veracity of Miller's rules. So now when we come to 9/11 and we see the third woe, radical Islam, and we see that the sequence of events really since the time of the end is mirroring that of Millerite history, I'm saying we have a confirmation of the central idea, of the central premise of the methodology, which is that sacred histories repeat, and Millerite history in particular is repeating in our time, right? So at 9/11, we have a confirmation of the methodology. If you want to look at the waymarks prior to 9/11 as witnesses, we have time of darkness, 1989, increase of knowledge, formalization, and then 9/11 itself. You have at least 5 witnesses bring you up to this point to show that Millerite history is repeating. So I'm suggesting that 9/11, in our time, the methodology is confirmed. Does that make sense? Right. So I want to illustrate it this way. That there is a progressive development that takes you to 9/11. Now, the next waymark I want us to take note of is 2014. Now, what happened in 2014? of course, this is a point at which we see an unsealing of light. This is when Ezra 7:9 is brought to view and is placed on the public record. The greatest, you could say, the greatest unsealing of light, the greatest opening up of prophetic truth since 9/11, really. And we've identified this as the beginning of the latter rain for the priests, right? Which is a correct identification. But 2014, there's an increase of knowledge. There's an unsealing of light on the message, right? And this unsealing of light has been progressive. It has been progressive. But as we've seen at the beginning, there was light unsealed on the message and the methodology. At 9/11, there is light unsealed, to be sure, but we see the message also, the methodology also being confirmed. Now in 2014, there's an opening up of light, but I also want to suggest that there's a further clarification of the methodology. There's a further clarification of the methodology. So I'll illustrate it from 9/11 to 2014 this way. Now, when we come to 2014, there's this opening up of light on Ezra 7:9, and there's a shaking that accompanies it. And for those of us who were there at the time, we know, or you would know, that the methodology, the subjects that were raised as the issues of contention were Joel, the day of the Lord, and the correctness of the deductions that were being arrived at through Ezra 7:9, such as, no public evangelism from 9/11 and other truths. But for those who were engaged in the discussions, in the debate that was taking place, you'll remember that the underlying issue was methodology. Right, and what that contention brought into focus was the validity of the methodology, its relationship to Miller's rules, and the correctness of the conclusions arrived at through it. So through that contention, methodology was the issue, but we came to a clearer understanding, at least I can say I personally did, of the centrality of the prophetic line methodology, a clear understanding of the methodology's relationship to Miller's proof texting, not as being antagonistic to Miller's rules, but being a further elaboration of the principles set forth in Isaiah 28, right? So there was definitely, as the methodology became a subject of contention, in defending it, it was further clarified, right? That's what we see in 2014. 2014, there's a progressive increase of knowledge, right? We have Ezra 7:9 being unsealed in 2014. We have the truth of the last president also being unsealed. Raphi and Panium being brought to view, and there is a crystallization of this midnight cry message, right, in 2018. And we see in 2018 a clarification of the message, I'll frame it that way, when the subject of time is brought to view. That's what we've been building towards since 2014. You could argue really since before then, at least since 2012. But since 2014, this is what we have been building to, the identification of time. And as we've seen that there's been a development of the message and in tandem, a development of the methodology, in 2018, as we see the crystallization or the, like the clarification of the message to the point where time is understood again, we have the methodology also being perfected, right? When we have parable teaching. Parable teaching being understood. And of course, this is leading us to November 9, 2019, which is the shut door. Okay, so this is not complicated, I don't think. I think it's easy to see if we're willing to see it. Why lay this out? Lay it out just to make one point, which is that we've come to a place in the movement where the subject of time, the midnight cry message, as well as the methodology of parable teaching have come into focus. And there has been a tendency of some, I should say, to view the relationship between this methodology and the understanding that has been held, I'll say from the beginning, how prophetic line upon prophetic line has been conceptualized from the beginning, to view the relationship between the two of them as right and wrong, right? That parable teaching is maybe they don't say this, but the impression is that it's a new, in fact, some do say this, that it's a new development. It's a break from that which has been put in place before. And if you view it that way, that this is a new development and a break from that which has been put in place before, then it's very easy to turn around and then start viewing things in terms of right and wrong. One is right, one is wrong. And when you create that dichotomy, it then makes it easy to take the next step and set up a dynamic where there's an us and them, right? There's an us and them. And, this development has been seen where, there's some old model people and new model people, and the insinuation is that the old model people are in error, and so on and so forth. And this is very unfortunate because, for one, I don't think it's necessary, quite frankly, and two, it's wrong. I think it's wrong because this methodology of parable teaching is not a new development. Strictly speaking, it's not a clean break. It is part of a progressive clarification of the message and methodology that began at the time of the end. It's part of a continuum, right? It's not something that took place in a vacuum. And if you view it, it is a clarification of our methodology, right? And not a singular occurrence that is, it's not a singular occurrence. It is the natural progression of a work that began in 1989. Now, what that does, if you view things that way, as opposed to the other way, is that it takes away the justification or the grounds that may feed into that tendency to view things in a sort of us and them sort of way. Does that make sense? And you view things not as us and them, not as old and new model people, not as, we're right and they're wrong, but you view things rather as, listen, we're brethren, we're learning, and this is part of the progressive development of our message, and we get on board, and we need to get on board with it, right? And I think if we view things that way, they are different, right? And if you view things that way, it makes it easier to win your brethren rather than set up a dynamic where there's a sort of adversarial tensions. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right? So I just laid this out just to make that point, that when we look at parable teaching, it's not an isolated development. It is part of the progressive clarification of the methodology that began when it was initially unsealed in 1989. So I hope we get that. That's one point. Now, for the rest of our time together, I want to put in place a second point. Now, this relates to the subject of time. Of course, we understand that November 9, 2019 is the shut door for us as priests. When the subject of time was initially considered, other lines of thought began to open up and began to be put on the public record. I'll say it, I did share some studies on 2021. Some of you may remember that. I personally requested that those studies be withdrawn, right? I requested that. And I did that because there was a climate that was developing within the movement, not removed from that which we are, with the issues that I was pointing out here, where, put it this way, where if it wasn't a distraction, the response that it was generating would have made it a distraction, when the focus really should be, and I believe it, and I teach it, that our primary focus should be on the shut door for us as priests. That's what we really need to understand and come to grips with. But none of us, at least, understood that there couldn't be any clarity brought to view on points subsequent to this year. So I withdrew those studies for that purpose, to allow people to focus on what was current, and if trusting that, look, if 2021, it's subsequent to our shut door, if it is correct, which I believe it is, and I believe it's correct. Why? Because it is based on the chiasm of 126. There's a chiasm of 126 that takes you to 2014. Rather, there's a symbolic 2520 of 126 that takes you to 2014. If you complete that chiasm, right, the 2520 is part of a larger chiasm. If you complete that chiasm, the very same chiasm from which we derive 2014, it takes you to 2021. So, you know, its identification as a waymark, and that there are things we can understand about it, I think is correct. What I will want us to reconsider, however, is its attachment to a waymark in our line, as to whether, you know, its connection with, is it Panium, is it a subsequent waymark, is it a waymark before Panium? That's what I want us to reconsider. And I want us to reconsider that also in light of the fact that other times have been identified. I think, whereas with 2021, we're just looking at a year. But now definite time for specific events have also been put on the public record in recent times. Some of you may know there's a study that has been broadcast. I'm sure most of you have come in contact with it, and many people have communicated with me about it. That's identifying July 18, 2020, specifically July 18, 2020, as a point at which would see radical Islam launch some sort of physical attack on the United States. And I don't think that's correct. And I feel it's important that we come to a point of clarity on this issue, because if we make predictions and they are not fulfilled, what effect will that have? It will have a negative effect. It will dampen the faith of those who believe those things, and it will put arguments in the mouths of naysayers, right? So I think it's important that we come to a point of clarity on these things. And I want to clarify that, but not based on going through the intricacies of the arguments presented for it. I want to do that based on the structure, affirming the structure of our line, of our reform line, to see that we cannot identify that we cannot make that identification, because it's also being identified as Panium. It's also being attached to a waymark as Panium. And I want us to show, does our line allow us to do that? Ultimately, what must we be governed by? We must be governed by the structure of our line. That we can rest upon, right? That we can rest our faith upon. And we need an experience in doing that. I'll just relate a story. Last night we were in having a conversation, a few of us in the building. I forget the building. Topaz, isn't it? And I referred back to the experience of what took place in 2014, where there was opposition that arose between brethren, right? And these, if you have brethren, and they're once your close brethren, really close brethren, they were close not only to you, but they were close to the partners in your ministry, right? And you come to a point where you realize that based on the line, that these brethren and close friends are wrong, right? And you reach a point where you're having to make really difficult and painful decisions, such as withdrawing invitations to speak at camp meetings, and, you're having to make really difficult decisions. And it's not just the response that you're getting from these brethren who are your friends, it's the response you're getting from some people in your own camp who don't understand, right? And say, and they're looking at it from a human perspective, that you don't do that to friends, right? And the tension and the pressure can become so great that you actually wonder, am I going mad? Am I doing the right thing? But within the context of that pressure, you keep coming back to, but the lines are showing that this is what is right. So leaning upon the testimony of the lines, right, you are buoyed or strengthened to pursue a course that to human eyes just lacks logic. To human eyes looks callous. To human eyes just looks wrong, right? And you are strengthened to persevere through that opposition, right? And then what do you see, right? You gain an experience where in the course of time vindicates all truth, right? In the course of time, it becomes seen that, the lines were right, right? And even those who had a mind to see it, see that the lines were right. And that's the experience that we all need, the experience of leaning upon the testimony of the lines of God's word in the face of opposition, leaning upon them in faith, right? So, because that's a microcosm of what's coming. Does that make sense? So we need to have that confidence individually that we can lean upon the lines, the structure of our lines. Of course, after having paid careful attention to ensure that we are laying them out correctly, we can lean upon them at all hazards. I think that's the expression, at all hazards, no matter what. So when we look at our line tells us when time is brought to view, when certain things are brought to view. I'll begin by laying out Millerite history, just briefly. Okay, yeah. So we have 1798, the arrival of the first angel. Then we have April 19, 1844, the arrival of the second angel. And in this history of the second angel, we have a number of camp meetings that are brought to view. We'll put October 22nd on the board here, right now. And what do we see in between? We have 3 camp meetings, don't we? These are Boston, and this was on July 21st. And this was followed by Concord. When was Concord? August 1st. And Concord was followed by Exeter. We have August 1st, we have August, we mark 15. So this is Millerite history, and I want to draw parallels between what we see here in Millerite history and what we see here in the reform line of the priests. So we have 1989 paralleling 1798. We have 9/11 paralleling April 1844. Now paralleling October 22nd, we have November 9, 2019. So as we see that we're repeating Millerite history to the very letter, we should see, and we know that Boston is a camp meeting, right? And it's a waymark. Exeter is a camp meeting. It's a waymark. Concord as a camp meeting, we also understand is a waymark. These three camp meetings parallel three waymarks that we see from 9/11 to 2014. And these have been laid out before. July 21st is midnight, and midnight in our line is (2014), or rather, Boston parallels 2014. I'll state it that way. August 1st parallels Concord, parallels 2016. And August 15, Exeter, parallels 2018. Okay. So, when we look at Boston in Millerite history, Boston was the beginning of the Midnight Cry message. It was the beginning of the Midnight Cry message and the arrival of the third angel in the history of the Millerites. When we look at 2014, 2014 is the same. It's the beginning of the Midnight Cry message, a progressive development of the Midnight Cry message in the history of the priests. When we look at Concord, Concord means agreement or harmony between people or groups. So with Concord, we have this imagery of agreement or harmony or unity being brought to view. And in 2016, we see a development which parallels that, which was steps being taken in the organization of the movement. These were steps taken to bring about concord, to bring about agreement, harmony, and unity within the body of people that comprise the movement. And then Exeter is when the Midnight Cry message went forth with greatest power. This was when the subject of time was preached with greatest power. 2018, I'm saying we see the same thing. 2018, the subject of time is being given, and it's now being given with greatest power. So 2014 to 2018, there's this progressive development of the Midnight Cry message before the shut door on November 9. So as we look at the characteristics of the Midnight Cry message in Millerite history, it speaks to the characteristics of the Midnight Cry message in our history, should it not? Right? I think we can agree on that. So when you look at the Midnight Cry in Millerite history, what was it? It was a body of messages. It was a body of messages, a body of truths that brought into focus one time, right? They brought into focus one time, and what was that time? The time of the shut door on October 22nd. Is that a correct characterization of Samuel Snow's message? It was a body of arguments, right? Different time prophecies, the feast days, different lines of arguments that he brought to view. It was a body of truths, but ultimately they were bringing into focus one time, and that time they were bringing to view was the shut door on October 22nd. So the characteristics of our midnight cry is the same. It's a body of truths, a body of messages, different lines of argument. But what are they bringing into focus? One time. And that time is the time of the shut door for us as priests, which is November 9. So if we just allow the characteristics of Snow's midnight cry to dictate the characteristics of our midnight cry, we see that our midnight cry is one time, and it's the time for our close of probation. So what is the implication of that? The implication of that is we cannot have multiple times. Does that make sense? And say that the midnight cry message consists of multiple times, because that's not what we saw in Millerite history. Right? So when other times are now being raised definite times, e.g. July 18, 2020, for, and if they're being presented as being part of this midnight cry message, that is both our warning and preparation for the next dispensation, right? Our warning and preparation for midnight. Based on Millerite history, just looking at the structure of it, that can't be correct. Can we see that? Right, so that's one line of argument. The next one, or the last one, I will draw from the line of the 144,000. What are the waymarks in the line of the 144,000? We see 1989, 9/11, Sunday law, close of probation, yes, and second coming, isn't it? Close of probation and second coming. From Millerite history, we've taken this history of the second angel as paralleling this history from 9/11 to November 9. I should finish the line before I complete this line of thought here, because we know that the history of the priest contains a binding off period, does not? If November 9, 2019 is midnight, well, it is, the binding off period for the priests ends at the midnight cry, right? So this is the complete history of the priests, right? It doesn't end at midnight, it ends at the midnight cry, because it encompasses the binding off period as well. Right, so having said that, now this history has given us information about this section here. But now, as we look at this section here, in the line of the 144,000, I want us to see that it will give us information on what happens in this section here. Let me just label these. This is Miller. This is the priest. This is the... As we line up the line of the 144,000 with the line of the priests, of course, 1989 parallels 1989. 9/11 parallels 9/11. The Sunday law parallels 2014. The close of probation parallels November 9. The second coming parallels the midnight cry. But I want us to focus in on this time period in the line of the 144,000 from the close of probation to the second coming, because it's going to give us a template for what the close of probation to the second coming, or midnight to the midnight cry in the history of the priest looks like. So the first passage I'm going to read is from Great Controversy, page 613. I'll read the first paragraph of 613. I'll skip to 615 to 616. So we have GC 613 and 615 to 616. And it says, "At that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was, since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book." So where is this passage located? The close of probation, right? It's starting us out at the close of probation in the line of 144,000. So continuing with 615, it says, "When God's presence was finally withdrawn from the Jewish nation, priests and people knew it not. Though under the control of Satan and swayed by the most horrible and malignant passions, they still regarded themselves as the chosen of God. The ministration in the temple continued. Sacrifices were offered upon polluted altars, and daily the divine blessing was invoked upon a people guilty of the blood of God's dear Son and seeking to slay his ministers and apostles." So she's drawing a parallel between the close of probation, AD 34, and she's about to draw a parallel with the close of probation as brought to view in Daniel 12, verse 1. So she goes on to say, "So when the irrevocable decision of the sanctuary has been pronounced, and the destiny of the world has been forever fixed, the inhabitants of the earth will know it not. The forms of religion will be continued by a people from whom the Spirit of God has been finally withdrawn, and the satanic zeal with which the Prince of Evil will inspire them for the accomplishment of his malignant designs will bear the semblance of zeal for God. As the Sabbath has become the special point of controversy throughout Christendom, and religious and secular authorities have combined to enforce the observance of the Sunday, the persistent refusal of a small minority to yield to the popular demand will make them objects of universal execration. It will be urged that the few who stand in opposition to an institution of the church and a law of the state ought not to be tolerated." So we see here in this close of probation time, there is the remnant who are still holding to the Sabbath truth. The Sunday law has become the point of controversy throughout Christendom. And the argument is then forwarded that the minority of opposers to the popular position should not be tolerated. And what do they determine to do? If we skip down a few lines, it says, they bring essentially the argument, paraphrasing it, that was brought by Caiaphas, which is it's better for a few people to die, that the whole nation perish not, right? Than for the whole nation to be thrown into confusion because of the intransigence of a minority. So he says, this argument will appear conclusive, and a decree will finally be issued against those who hallow the Sabbath of the fourth commandment, denouncing them as deserving of the severest punishment and giving the people liberty after a certain time to put them to death. Right. So after the close of probation, there is a decree. There is a death decree. And of course, it's within the context of this death decree that God's people are saved, right? That God's people, that Christ comes the second time to take his people home. But before Christ comes, there's a development that is seen in Great Controversy, chapter 40. Now, this is from page 640. Page 640. I'll read paragraph 2 and the beginning of paragraph 3. It says, "The voice of God is heard from heaven, declaring the day and the hour of Jesus' coming, and delivering the everlasting covenant to his people. Like peals of loudest thunder, his words roll through the earth. The Israel of God stand listening with their eyes fixed upward. Their countenances are lighted up with his glory, and shine as did the faces of Moses when he came down from Sinai. The wicked cannot look upon them, and when the blessing is pronounced on those who have honored God by keeping his Sabbath holy, there is a mighty shout of victory. Soon there appears in the east a small black cloud, about half the size of a man's hand. It is the cloud which surrounds the Savior." Right. So we see that Christ comes. That's the cloud, identifying Christ's second coming. But what do we see brought to view in the previous paragraph? We see the day and the hour, the time of Christ's second coming being given, right? As an aside, it's often argued that, if you read Ellen White's statements at face value, they tell you that there's never going to be time. That's how then it's interpreted, right? After 1844, there's never time again. But if you insist on reading those passages that way, without bringing the parameters of time and context, you just read them as blanket statements, you bring her into contradiction with herself, because we see here the 144,000 being given time, right? She says the day and the hour before Christ's second coming. Do we see that? Right. So now, when we look at this line of the 144,000 and we bring it here, what does that tell us? Close of probation to second coming. We have two waymarks between 2019 and the midnight cry. And these two waymarks parallel the death decree and the identification of time of the second coming. Right, because November 9, if this is the close of probation, and the midnight cry is the second coming. If we state it differently, this is Raphia, and this is Panium. So, if the midnight cry is Panium, in the context of 144,000 is the second coming, when is definite time for the second coming given in our line? It's not given here before Raphia, is it? Definite time for the second coming is given shortly before, it's given post Raphia, right? But before Panium. Right, so not only is it problematic to be identifying the midnight cry message as multiple times, we saw that that is problematic based on the structure of the midnight cry in Millerite history. But we see that the line of the 144,000 allows us to locate when definite time for Panium is given. And it's not given before midnight. It's given after midnight. So if we're identifying other dates as Panium, a definite date for Panium, right, based on the structure of the reform line, we can't do that. We can't do that and be correct, at any rate. So I guess the question is, we need to learn to lean upon the structure of the line and to allow it to govern the deductions that we arrive at. And I'll make one last point, which relates to the subject of methodology. Just 1 minute on this, then we'll close. Is when we look at the development of the methodology from 1989 to present, it's the same methodology. It's the same methodology, which is prophetic line upon prophetic line. You don't have grounds, or maybe you do. If you do, you'll have to show me, because I don't believe we do. You don't have grounds to identify, based on Millerite history, or any other line for that matter, the identification of a new methodology, right? A new methodology even in Millerite history, it's the same methodology, Miller's rules, that was used in that reform line, was it not? So, I mean, the deductions, we see a new methodology, a different methodology being used to arrive at definite time. And that's the use of chronological calculations. Right now, chronology can be useful in terms of clarifying the histories that have been, because we use the natural, right? The histories that have been, we need to understand them closely so that we come to more robust applications. We need to understand the natural in order to understand to make correct application in the spiritual, right? But so chronology has its place in that sense, but to use chronological calculations to arrive at definite time, to identify new waymarks and arrive at definite time for those waymarks, that's not, you'll have to justify why, how is it that where do we get justification to introduce a new methodology to begin with? Do you get that? Right? And I'm saying based on the structure of our line, we don't. So that's it. This is the first study. In the next one, I just want to take us through this concept of parable teaching and to begin to investigate together, right? Well, I'll share what I've come to anyway, on what those principles and parameters look like in application. Right? We're going to go through some parables, we're going to go through some histories, different portions of scripture, and to try to help us see, right? So we have maybe a practical idea of then how to go about it for ourselves, because we all must come to a place where we have a level of comfort in applying these principles and these rules in our personal study. Let's close the prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for the ground that we've been able to cover. Lord, may you guide us into all truth as you've been guiding us up to this point. May you please bless this camp meeting. And Lord, we're at a very solemn and important place in the history of our reform movement. Help us all, dear Father, to make our calling and election sure. Not to leave our eternal destinies, Lord, on guesswork, but to be sure that we're building upon the right foundation. Please be with those, our loved ones, and those who we are concerned for, dear Father, that they take their stand firmly on the side of truth also. May be with them and keep them, and may be with us through the remainder of this day. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.